So I'd like to invite Graham Maguire to come and present on Should I Do a PhD?
Thanks, Davina. And thank you for those for coming in on a Saturday. I think you'll find as your career progresses that your Saturdays aren't necessarily sacrosanct for having time off, and it's part of professionalism, I think, of being a physician, that you have to be flexible with your time. Remember today, if you can or want to vote, please do. And I'll just launch now into my presentation about doing a PhD. Aaron, could you just wave or something if I'm getting close to time, a few minutes to time? Thanks. So, well, it's a big decision, and it's a decision being increasingly made by people as they get to the end of their advanced training. So I think it is really important that we think about, should we be doing a PhD, why we do it, and what we can expect to get out of it. There's a million different reasons to do a PhD, and there are a million different PhDs that you can do. So what I'm talking about today will very much be based on my own personal journey when I did my PhD. And since I've worked both in the university and in the independent research sector, and now back in the government sector, regarding research as a clinician. So it's probably worthwhile to get an idea of where I come from. So I now work, I head up general medicine at Western Health, and I started in Melbourne and did my basic training at Royal Melbourne, and then went up to Darwin and did some ID advanced training, and then came back to Melbourne and did my respiratory advanced training, and then spent some time working at Port Moresby General at the just being a sort of junior consultant. Went and did my PhD back in Darwin across the top end of the Northern Territory, looking at the epidemiology and pathophysiology of chronic lung disease. Went and worked in Brizzy, a PA, for a bit. Went over and was a remote outreach clinician in the Kimberley for about 5 years. Went across to Cairns and worked at Cairns base, and then worked up and down the Cape doing remote outreach as well. Went to the desert and lived in Alice Springs for 4 years, running a research institute there, and then ended up back in Melbourne a few years ago. So I suppose what I'd like to say is the great thing about being a physician is that it opens up lots of different opportunities for yourself. What you're doing today, next year, or in 5 years' time won't be what you're doing in 15 years' time, I really hope anyway. And we now know and we accept that we're all going to change and develop our careers. So first thing is, a PhD can actually allow you to move around a bit and do a lot of different things. All right, I used to have darker hair. Why I did a PhD? Honestly, I did a PhD because I didn't know what I wanted to do. It's probably why I did medicine and why I became a physician as well. So it's sort of all right to do a PhD if you're just not sure where you want to go to next, because we'll talk about it, but it can be a really great indulgence in the first time for 10 or 15 years you've had some headspace. So I did my PhD out bush, so I ended up travelling a hell of a lot, and had my first son while I was doing my PhD. All right, so today I'm going to talk about the pros and cons, what's involved, tips and tricks, after a PhD, now what, and perhaps just share with you what I maybe would have done differently. Okay, look, the research environment in Australia is competitive and crowded. There are lots of people who are really smart out there, and they don't have medical degrees, but they've spent a hell of a lot of time in university, and they've really selected themselves out as the best and the brightest. Australia's hooked on PhDs. We graduate huge amounts of them. We believe that they are somehow inextricably linked to GDP growth, and so the Australian government loves them. And there's so many people enrolled in PhDs, so you're not going to be that unique. And I suppose the other thing about a research career is that if you want to actually get money eventually to do research that you want to do, it's a really competitive funding environment. and less than 15% at the moment of NHMRC project grants. That'll take you 2 weeks to write, actually eventually get funded. But the great thing about a PhD is that you will become an expert, and it's really nice because when someone asks that question in your area, they will turn to you and you will be able to actually be the expert in a very small field of knowledge. And so that's really nice because it allows you to actually feel that you're contributing something back to your the area that you've studied. The bad side or the downside is that if you want to do a PhD right, it's not a walk in the park. It's a lot of work. You don't get a roster at the beginning of the rotation for your PhD and this is what you're going to do. You just get pointed in a direction and you have to be self-directed and you have to work hard if you want it to actually be successful. So don't kid yourself that it's going to be easy, but it is enjoyable and should be enjoyable. So I suppose just in summarising, I think the real pros of a PhD are this idea for the first time you will sit down at a desk and you will be able to say, I am going to think about this issue. I'm going to research it. I'm going to actually ask an answerable research question and I'm going to see exactly how I would answer that, whether I can answer it. You can actually make a difference. You won't make a difference next week. You won't make a difference necessarily next year to your area of study, but if you contribute to knowledge, it's amazing how in 5, 10, 15 years' time, the knowledge you've generated will make some sort of difference to what we do. I think you can develop new skills. I find that, my biostats epidemiology skills are fantastic. I'm a terrible lab scientist and I know that, so that's also really good. I know what I'm not good at. Clinician researchers are in demand. It's a way that you can certainly rise above the average candidate for a competitive consultant job. You can do future research. As I say, your job options are better. You don't pay HECS for a PhD, so that's got to be good. You don't end up with more debt, and you end up with publications which make your CV look better, which make your job opportunities look better. You don't earn much money. 20% of your time, usually for your PhD, you can do clinical work. So that plus a PhD scholarship is sort of in the high 30s, thousands tax-free. You can get by, but you're not going to actually get rich. It can sometimes be very slow. Remember, most PhDs take, at least 3 years and often 4 years to do. You don't get a lot of immediate satisfaction. It takes a hell of a lot of time to get your first publications out, to get your first study through, to get the data to actually be able to actually say something about your field of study. As I say, it's lots of work. When the downside about future job options, becoming a full-time researcher is a really hard gig. Being a clinician researcher is a lot easier, but if you want to be a full-time researcher, it's a really competitive field. So I think while you're doing your PhD, always think that you're probably going to come back to clinical medicine in some capacity. So keep your clinical skills up and keep your clinical networks going. So that 20% of clinical time that you do while you're doing your PhD, sort of make sure it counts and you're working for the people who you want to work in the future. And all of the issue about opportunity cost, because if you think about it, this is 4 years of a consultant income. If you actually look at the opportunity foregone, that's quite substantial. And it's also 4 years that perhaps 3 or 4 years that your colleagues who don't do PhDs have been off doing a clinical fellowship and, McMaster or something. So just put that in perspective. So I suppose this just says how you go. It just, research can be an all-consuming career. Okay. So what's involved? The most important thing is you have a plan. Do not go into a PhD thinking, I'll do whatever, I'll just see what happens. You must have a plan from the beginning. If you do not have a plan, you will go long and the thing will go on it will seem to go on forever. So you have to have a very clear plan about what you're doing from the beginning. And to do that, you've got to have a good supervisor. If you don't have a good supervisor, I don't really care so much what the project is, but if you don't have a good supervisor, you're going to run the risk of getting in trouble. And what is a good supervisor? A good supervisor is not someone who's really friendly and cheery and your best friend. A good supervisor is someone who has supervised other people successfully to completion within time and has generated publications for their student, preferably their students who are happy. So if I was going to say anything, choose your supervisor very carefully and talk to students that your supervisor is actually supervising now or has successfully completed supervision recently, because that's going to really give you an insight of how this is going to work. If your supervisor don't work, your PhD don't work. As I say, your supervisor is not your friend. Supervisors are nice people, I'm not saying that, but they aren't there to be your friend. There's something in it for a supervisor. And what they get is, particularly for some people such as yourself, they get smart, motivated people who want to finish a PhD within 3 years. Okay. They also get these people without cost, because usually you come with a PhD scholarship, and they get publications. Okay, all of these things, and potentially also in your interest as well. But realise that's what your supervisor will want out of a PhD student. They want smart people for free who generate publications, which then progresses their career, which allows them to get competitive research funding and continue to do what they want to do. Where you do your PhD is and what your PhD is on is sort of a less of an important issue. Of course, if you want to be an endocrinologist, make sure it's got something to do with endocrinology, but don't try to second guess what the next sexy area is going to be, because you just never know. Now, find a supervisor that you think's good and who's working vaguely in the area that you want your clinical career to progress, and actually talk to them. It's a great opportunity. Since you're going to be poor, you may as well be poor somewhere exotic. So it's an opportunity, if your mortgage isn't too large in your family and you don't have kids going to school, to actually begin to move around a bit. Okay. So I went off and worked across the top of Australia. The project, as I say, it's the least of your worries, but if there's another thing that you need a good supervisor. You also need to make sure your supervisor has funding for what they want you to do. You want to make sure that they don't need to fund necessarily your salary. You should get a scholarship if it's a good enough project, okay, but you do want to have funding for your project. And you need to really keep an eye on the clock, because if you go slow, before you know it, 3 years is up and you haven't finished, and you'll be getting grief from the university, your partner, and you'll be wondering, why aren't I finished? Okay, as I say, the key thing about where you go is about your family. The great thing when you're a doctor, you can always find work, you can always be useful. But your family, if you're going to travel with the family, is key. You've got to think about your partners, job opportunities. You've got to think if the kids are getting into primary school, you've got to think about schools. And you've got to think about support for your family, because if you take them off to somewhere really isolated or remote, or that's very culturally different to where you are now, your family will be the ones who take the impact. You'll have a great time. You go to work, you hang out with exciting people, everyone's happy, but you've got to really look after your family if you're going to move off-site. As I say, if I'm talking about tips and tricks and things I did wrong, do not go back to clinical work before you submit your PhD. Don't kid yourself that you can somehow go back to full-time job or take on that consultant job and I'll just write up while I'm doing it. It's a fantastic way to delay your PhD. Get the thing finished before you actually take on a new challenge. You've got to publish, and you've got to publish, and do you have to publish? Yes. And you've got to do it early. So if you're going to do a PhD by thesis, by publication. And I'd expect most of my PhD students would get somewhere between sort of 5 and 7 publications. So I know other areas are a bit lighter than that, but you'd sort of hope to get about 5 publications out of it by the end of it. Go to meetings. Often you can get scholarships. It's great. You get to go off to exotic locations and stay in bad accommodation. But it's a real opportunity to develop your networks both locally and internationally. and develop that long-term vision and a narrative about what you're doing as you go along. So if you're doing something in endocrinology and diabetes, then you might want to just see how that segues with your career aspirations as well. And when you're done, the question will come, what you do you go off and do a postdoc, or do you actually head back into the clinical workforce? It really depends on how poor you want to be for a while, I suppose. If you really want to, from an income point of view, going back to clinical medicine after your PhD makes a lot of sense. It won't be good for your research career because you'll become distracted by clinical work. You can go off and do a postdoc, but they don't pay well. They're a fantastic way to go down the path of really consolidating a research career. But again, how long do you have to keep going until you get a real job? Might become the persuasive argument. So what I might have done differently with my PhD, I didn't really know what I was doing at the beginning. I sort of just I didn't want to get a real consultant job. So I went off to Darwin and just sort of sat down in one place until someone came by and picked me up. So I wasn't clear on what I was doing. So I wasted my first year trying to decide what I wanted to do. The other thing I did was my supervisor was away for the first 6 months of my PhD, which meant I somewhat drifted for the first 6 months without direction. So again, it comes back to supervision and having a project. And my project didn't have funding when I decided what it was. So I spent the next 6 months applying for funding for my project. So make sure your project has funding. My PhD ended up being way too ambitious, which probably came back to my supervisor, I suppose, and my own naivety. So I ended up doing too much, which took too long. So my PhD took about 4 years to do. All of these things, you could turn them around and say, I learned how to do funding applications. It was a really good growth experience. I had to develop my own project. I had to become an independent researcher early. And all of these things could be turned around, but honestly, at the time, it didn't feel that good. And like always, I think as I've highlighted with you guys, I didn't publish enough out of my PhD. And there was a lot of stuff I realised in retrospect that could have been published that I didn't publish. So there's no use doing good work and then not sharing it. So just make sure you get out there and publish. So in summary, should I or should you do a PhD? Don't be naive. Don't kid yourself that you're doing it for anyone than mainly yourself, okay? It's an academic indulgence, okay? You may discover the new cure for some rare genetic mutation associated with some rare cancer. But chances are you're not going to make a huge and dramatic impact with your PhD in the short term to your area of study. You will make a contribution, but you're doing it for yourself, so make sure you're aware of that when you start. I think we have to realise that as clinician researchers, most of us don't expect research to become our career. I think it can become an important component of your life and a great component. You can do research, have students, but you'll still, I think, as physicians want to be clinicians as well. If nothing else, I find the delay I get in return from research, what you do, getting the idea to the project, to the data, to the findings, to dissemination, to making a difference, that delay, or I can just go on a ward round and get a buzz from making a difference to someone's life in 5 minutes. It's quite different. So I think we're really lucky and we should use both of those. It's a really competitive funding environment. Look, with the MRFF, things may improve. I haven't seen the direct benefits into clinical research yet, but with increased money sloshing around the system, I think we will probably find it's easier to find money for the sort of research we do as clinicians, since the MRFF has a lot of money and it has a focus on translational research. Whatever the case, when you do a PhD, you come out smarter, you come out a better clinician, and you come out a better researcher. And you come out as someone who, when people say there's a problem, you think of question and then you think of a way to answer it. And that's not just in research, that can be in quality, that can be in how you manage HR, how you manage clinical workflow. You become actually better at just being a contributor to healthcare. And it will shape you. You're a different person after doing a PhD than when you started. And I think that's all. Any questions? Can we take questions, Aaron? Have we got that?
Yes, they should be able to hear them online.
Who's thinking of doing a PhD? My God. Here we go. Good. What do you think about, from an AT point of view, what proportion of ATs do you think go off and do a PhD? About half of them at the moment? Do you think? Certainly with mine, it's about that at the moment. So it's increasing, particularly depending on the area that you're interested in and where you're planning to work. Sometimes it can also be practically a requirement in getting a job. But look, you might always worry, I'm never going to get a job back at, the Royal whatever hospital. But can I say, there are so many job opportunities and there are so many opportunities to make a difference all over the country and all over the world. I think it's important to be not too tight. If you don't get a job back exactly where you want to, there will be opportunities and ways to get jobs elsewhere. And you can always come back to the big smoke at a later stage if you bring those skills with you. Questions? Yes.
I've got a question. I'm actually a final year AT and doing part-time PhD at the moment. One of the dilemmas is, because all of my, like you mentioned, the colleagues who will be finishing will be able to move on and get consultant jobs, etc. Do you have any advice or any suggestions how a person who's going to be finishing AT but still got PhD going for them, what sort of options are there? Like, it might be a big thing to become a consultant. It's a new role with lots of challenges, etc. Is there anything else out of your practical experience or anything that you've seen with your students that you would advise for people maybe in my situation? Because I'm sure there's going to be a lot of people in that situation.
Well, I think if you're full-time, you can usually still do 20% clinical time, and that's not necessarily a day a week. It can be packaged in lots of different ways. So I think using that clinical time really sensibly to make sure you work or hang out or help the people who you might want to work with in the future makes a lot of sense, because then they have some skin in the game. You've got that sort of social capital built up. The other thing, if it's possible, also make sure as you're going through your PhD and you've got stuff to present, you keep taking it back and participating in the education activities in the area, in the organisation. And then it's not so much when you finish your PhD that they sort of assume you've always been in the department, and when the FTE comes up, you just seamlessly slide into it, sort of thing. So just ingratiate yourself totally in a self-serving fashion. Yeah.
Any tips regarding funding application? As you mentioned, it's highly competitive.
So if you've got a good supervisor, your supervisor will have a scholarship for you for the first year. Okay, and that'll be a tax-free scholarship, plus you get your 20% clinical time. If it's a half-decent project, my experience with my students has been you'll get a competitive research scholarship for your second year, if not for your first. So whether that's NHMRC or whether it's, Cardiac Society or, whatever it is, there are lots of PhD scholarships around. So to do a PhD without a scholarship is, I wouldn't advise it, let's say, because you'll end up having to work and it'll distract you. So as I say, just make sure your supervisor, part of your discussion will be, well, where's my scholarship coming from? If they haven't even thought that through, then look sideways at your supervisor a bit, because they should have. Yep. And Aaron, I think that's it. Thank you very much. Oh, thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Maguire. That was very insightful, I think. And I spent two years working in the Northern Territory, actually, so maybe a bit nostalgic. Some of that hospital accommodation was very familiar. And they were actually the best 2 years of my training. So big plug for the NT if any